What's up, castaways? Happy Friday and welcome back to another video. So today we're going to be doing a video on the Moog Sub 37. Now I've had the Sub 37 for years now, but I've still never made a full video on that, and that's about to change today. I was thinking recently about what makes a classic instrument, something like a Fender Stratocaster, for example. A Fender Strat can be used by anyone from any genre, whether you're a beginner or a pro. I still remember the day I got my first Strat 15 years ago for Christmas. It was a cheap knockoff, it didn't really stay in tune, but it inspired me to play every single day. Fast forward years later, I still play Fender Stratocasters even after having tried many different guitars. Now, I think the Sub 37 shares a lot of the same DNA with something like a Fender Strat, where all of the parts together really create something magical and inspirational that resonates with a lot of people. Now the proof is in the pudding. The Moog Sub 37 can be seen in touring bands, in film composer studios, with techno producers, with amateur musicians, everything and anything. So while it's long overdue, today I'm going to do an overview of the Moog Sub 37 and show you guys hopefully why after all these years, the Sub 37 still makes it onto almost all of my tracks, and it's still one of my biggest recommendations for someone looking for their first professional synthesizer. The Sub 37 sounds awesome, it looks great, and most importantly, it's so inspiring to play. So one more thing, before we get started, I just announced my brand new single Stardust featuring Gioto. If you want to check that out, the pre-save link is in the description below. It'll be out worldwide on April 13th. Alright guys, as always, if you like this content, consider liking, subscribing, and checking out my Patreon, and let's get started on the Moog Sub 37. Alright guys, so here we are on the front panel of the Sub 37. Now, even years later, looking at this thing right away, I love the way it looks and I love the way it was designed aesthetically. Now, that might sound a little bit shallow, but like any great instrument, a lot of care has gone into exactly where everything is, the way that everything looks, the visual cues that it gives you, and I think that's one of the things that makes it such an inspiring instrument. The distance between certain knobs, where each section of the synth is, all of these things really amount to an instrument that's extremely intuitive and quick to program. So starting off with an init patch, we get there by holding down the init button, really nice and easy. So we start off with a saw wave. Now the Sub 37 has two oscillators and one sub oscillator. The oscillators here are variable between triangle all the way through pulse. It's extremely smooth, it sounds great on literally every waveform, and the sound engine is just overall fantastic here. Got your triangle for those, chill sounds. The saw wave I probably use the most, it's a classic Moog saw wave. Square for that fatness, and then of course your pulse wave modulation. Awesome, so let's bring in a couple of other oscillators here, the sub and the OSC2. Listen to that sub. Right away we've got that Moog fatness. Let's take away the sub for now. So we've got our octave control here. And we've also got here our frequency control on OSC2, of course. Really nice that you can just kind of go through and smoothly modulate the pitch there. I much prefer that to semitones like some other synths. And here we've got something really special, which is called beat frequency. Now, if you notice here, when I've got the frequency knob up to detune it, as I go up the keyboard, the cycles between the detune decrease. Whereas the beat frequency here, it's going to remain constant all the way through. If you want to have your beating in time, or you like a slower beat frequency, you can do that on Sub 37, which is really cool. Really great for respaces. It's just an instant respace machine. Awesome. Yeah, so right there, that's a feature I use all the time. In fact, I don't use the frequency knob all that much unless I'm trying to get some sort of interesting interval. Because the beat frequency works so well. Really quick here, you notice that the Sub 37, if you're listening on good headphones, it might sound a little bit dark. Now the reason for that is because the keyboard tracking is defaulted to on, and also the filter slope determines that well. So yeah, while the Sub 37 is a bit of a darker synth, there are lots of things you can do to make it brighter. So I don't think that's ever been an issue for me. There you go, nice and bright. We'll get to the filter later, but it's worth mentioning because I've heard that as one of the criticisms before of the Sub 37. Awesome, so going back to the oscillators briefly, so we've got a hard sync mode. Analog hard sync just sounds so awesome, so smooth, even though it's really intense. Sounds great. We can do keyboard reset for the waveform, which makes it start at a fixed point every single time. But to be totally honest, I never use that because I love the instability of analog. But yeah, I mean that's gonna sound like just your typical saw wave on a digital synth almost. Much better to have the instability for this kind of instrument, I think. Anyway, and then of course we've got our duophonic mode, which is one of the selling points at the time of the Moog Sub 37, but to be honest, I rarely use it. I have plenty of polysynths for other things, and I think the Sub 37 really excels as a mono synth, but you know, it's there if you want it. You can change the keyboard control, you can make it drone essentially. Pretty cool, I guess, if you want to have some sort of ambient drone pad in the background, or make it, you know, low note priority or high note priority. I usually just leave it on high note priority if I'm going to use it. But again, you know, I really don't think you're buying the Sub 37 specifically to play, you know, duophonically with it. It's more of a bonus feature. This is a mono synth, true and true. Moving on to the mixer section, the mixer is actually, you know, one of my favorite parts of this synth, and I think one of the most misunderstood parts of this synth. So if we bring in a couple just basic saw waves here, as we get past 12 o'clock, you're going to start to hear that the synth is going to saturate and distort. Now, this was something that was a little bit unpopular at the time, so much so that they added extra headroom rather with the subsequent 37. So the reason why they did that is because it really does distort and saturate quickly on this synth. You have to be very careful with your gain staging. So if we listen here, you can hear it start to really saturate. Let me try that again so you can hear exactly what I'm talking about. If you hear it's getting louder up to a certain point, and then after a certain point, it doesn't get louder, and instead it sort of fills out more while staying the same volume and gets more bassy. Listen to that. If there was more headroom, what you should hear is you should hear the top end remain constant, but instead we get this really like warm, sort of like saturated, I know it's literally saturation, but there's no other word for it, warm saturated sound. Now, this is one of those things where, you know, there's been some cons towards the Sub 37 is, oh, the mixer distorts easily, it's a muddy synth. But I think this synth actually teaches you a lot about gain staging, and it's one of my favorite things about it, because if I want that literally saturated sound like I'm going through an overdrive pedal, I can do that. I'm going to grab all my oscillators on full, beat frequency, multi-drive, feedback, sounds amazing, right? Like that's a fat sounding synth. But if I don't want that, I can totally still get away with something much more subtle and nuanced. To watch, we turn all these up to 4. Just a little bit of multi-drive, and then we turn the master volume up. Sounds completely different. It literally, all of the same ingredients are here: drive, feedback, OSC2, OSC1, sub, but it sounds completely different because of how impactful the mixer is on the sound. So rather than viewing it as a mixer that distorts easily, I would challenge you guys to, if you do have a Sub 37 and you've run into that problem before, view it instead as a sound design tool, because there's many times where I'll have the mix extremely low and I'll just slam everything into the mixer here, and it literally sounds even better than running it through a lot of my high-end distortion pedals. Whereas sometimes I'll also have the output volume high, and I'll help it out with some, you know, preamp plugins in the studio, and I'll have everything nice and low. It's a very low noise synth, so you can do that, and then you can get these really sweet, you know, singing undistorted tones. Anyway, no, the mixer is awesome on this thing. That's one of my favorite things about it. In fact, you know, it's any Moog has a good mixer, but this one for sure is really special, and I think a little bit misunderstood. Moving on here, we've got a noise source. Now, the noise source, I do believe it's digital. Not that that really matters, but it's there. Great for percussion, but it's not too usable for a lot of other things, as there is a lot of low bass frequency in it. If there is a way to high pass filter it through the app, I'm sure that there is. I haven't used the 37 app in a little while, so it's escaping my memory, but on the front panel at least, it would have been great to have a noise high pass filter. The Matriarch has that in the global settings, and it's extremely useful to be able to have more of a sort of bright white noise rather than a pink noise or a traditional white noise to layer in with sounds. And then finally here, you guys saw me use it earlier, but one of the sweetest features of the mixer is the feedback / external in. So you can input an external synth if you have it connected by MIDI or CV, and you know, get a third full oscillator. That's cool. But where the joy of this is the classic Mini Moog feedback trick. So back in the day, what people used to do is run the headphone output of the Mini Moog into the input of the Mini Moog, and essentially create a feedback loop. And the Sub 37, they have exactly that built in without having to actually, you know, run the risk of damaging your synth by running a headphone out into it. So this runs feedback, and it is extremely awesome and unpredictable, and creates some extremely natural and organic distortion. So we'll turn it up here. That just sounds absolutely gargantuan, like massive. Huge. Yeah, the feedback, you know, it's not only great for distortion, but one of the things that I love doing with it here is on any sound, just turning it up to about 25%, 30%. and it's just going to add that little bit of buttery warmth and unpredictability and distortion. It's a really, really nice ingredient to have subtly in your sound. One of my favorite features for sure. Moving on to the filter, the Moog ladder filter. It's famous. It's one of the reasons why this synth is such a classic, in my opinion. Having that big chunky filter knob with the perfect resistance. It's one of those things where like you grab this and you can't help it. No other filter, in my opinion, sounds like a ladder filter. Whether you find the loss of bass annoying or not, there's no bass compensation on this, just putting that out there. It would have been cool to have, but it sounds so unique and so good in my opinion. The most amazingly musical resonance there. Awesome. So we've got our multi-drive here. We've already gone through that, but just incredible. Like I've always said that almost every synth that I've tried that has a built-in distortion on the filter ends up being a synth I like. You know, like it's one of those things where you always lose a little bit of frequency and presence when you're using a filter. So having the distortion, the analog drive right there to bring it back in is just such a good feature. And the multi-drive on the Sub 37 still sounds amazing. You know, headroom be damned, this thing just screams, and it works so well for leads, basses, you name it. We've already gone through this, but we have different slopes. Really cool feature. I do find that I mostly stick to either 24 or 12 because it's what I've been accustomed to making, but having a 6 dB ladder filter is pretty unique. Yeah, it's a great little feature to have there on the front panel, and it really helps with experimentation. Then down here, we've got our kind of traditional keyboard tracking. I usually keep this pretty much off because it is a pretty dark synth, and I do find that unless I'm making some sort of resonance tracking sound where I'm going to try to make the synth filter be played, I'm going to keep the keyboard tracking off so that I can have access to those brighter tones if I want. What is pretty revolutionary and really cool here is the envelope generators here. So we've got 2 envelopes, and on the surface, they look like your typical ADSR. But in reality, these envelopes are really, really special. All right, so let's create a pluck sound here to show what I mean. Okay, so we've got our pluck sound here. So we'll add in some delay, some hold. We've got velocity right there in the front panel. Let's turn down the delay and hold for a sec there so you can hear what I'm talking about. Really useful feature to have right there on the front panel. And then keyboard tracking as well too. Really awesome. But where these envelopes really jump to the next level for me is with the ability to be looped and synced. So what I'm going to show you guys here is what happens when we essentially just start to play with the idea of syncing envelopes to our BPM and to other functions on the synth. So if I play one note and then I loop it, all right, we've got it synced here. Now let's do the same with our regular envelope here. We haven't even used any sort of sequencer or LFO, and we're already getting some really cool polyrhythms. Very cool. I'll show you guys that later in more detail once we get to the mod section. Next up, we've got an arpeggiator. So we can do a bunch of different modes like up, down, the order you played. random, and then we have a sequencer. Classic stuff, really, really fun. Next up, we've got glide here. Now, the glide is pretty full featured. Actually, we can either glide one oscillator or both. Allowing for some pretty cool detunes. There's 3 different modes, including exponential, and then a couple other ones that have various different degrees of glide, gated, legato. But yeah, it's a pretty fully functioned glide module there. Moving on, we've got our 2 LFOs, and these are just, classic, easy to use, experiment heavy LFOs where you can really modulate anything you want on the synth really easily. Now, there's a couple pre-routed ones like pitch here. Filter. And then a whole bunch on the bottom, like, your classic, like, OSC1 wave. For pulse mod. But what's absolutely amazing is here, what we can do is we just hold down this button and then we twist any knob and then it's modulated. We did resonance right there. How about OSC2 volume? Amazing, right? Like that right there is all about the philosophy of the Moog Sub 37. It's hands-on, it's fast, it's quick to use. The LFOs can also be synced to the whole synth, the sequencer, and even the envelopes. Remember how I said earlier that the syncing and looping envelopes can work really well with the LFOs? Well, here's what that sounds like. Let me show you guys the magic of everything working together in sync mode. Now, I know that wasn't the quickest tour, but I'm glad that I was able to at least go through in detail the synth because it's so hands-on and each of the parts work so well together as a whole. Now, the last thing I'm going to show you guys is just going from scratch how I would make a sound that I use in pretty much every single song. Now, it's not a complicated sound, so if you're advanced to sound design, this might seem pretty basic, so feel free to skip to my final thoughts, but I just want to show you guys how intuitive and hands-on it is creating sounds with the Sub 37. All right, so starting out, we're going to initialize a patch here. We're going to bring up the OSC1 to about 50%, OSC2 to 50%, and sub OSC to about 75%. We're going to take the frequency range of OSC2 to 1/5 up and 1 octave up. Now we're going to go ahead and bring our filter down, feedback in 25%, like I said, multi-drive 50, resonance at about 40. And now we're going to grab some reverb off screen here. Amazing, right? Like 30 seconds and already that could be an idea for a track. I don't know why, but Moog synths for some reason work so well with really long reverb tails. They don't seem to get muddy as long as you don't have a lot of bass in your reverb. I don't know why, maybe if somebody else knows, but Moogs and reverb is like bread and butter, you know, peanut butter and jam, whatever you want to say, just works so well. But yeah, that's pretty much the tour of the synth. Let's hop to the conclusion and check out my thoughts on the outro. Alright guys, so that brings my overview of the Sub 37 to a close. Now hopefully you can see through there, much like something like a Fender Stratocaster, the synth just begs you to play it. Everything is laid out so logically, it's so inspiring to look at, and it sounds amazing. Everything reacts organically to your touch. It's just one of those instruments where it takes only a few hours to learn the basics, but an entire lifetime to master. I'm still learning new tips and tricks from the Moog Sub 37, even after having it for years. As always, that's all for today. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and I'll see you guys in the next video.